Thank you and good morning on behalf of the U.S. campaign to ban landmines. Welcome. We are a coalition of non-governmental organizations working to achieve a comprehensive ban on the use of anti-personnel landmines, as well as U.S. accession to the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty, as more than 160 nations have already done. We are the national affiliate of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, founded in 1992, and the recipient of the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize, together with ICBL coordinator Ms. Jody Williams of Vermont. We also support sustained U.S. governmental financial support for mine clearance and victim assistance. Today's briefing was originally planned as the milestone 5th review conference of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Antipersonnel Mines and their destruction, also known as the Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty, is opening in Siem Reap, Cambodia on November 25th. However, many of you may have seen the reporting by the Washington Post last night that the U.S. plans to transfer these internationally banned indiscriminate weapons to Ukraine. While information is still coming out on the decision, we will do our best to answer your questions today. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to begin by stating the U.S. campaign to ban landmines unequivocally condemns the White House decision to transfer these weapons and urges an immediate reversal. Thank you all for joining. To begin, I'm honored to introduce Congressman Jim McGovern, who represents the 2nd District of Massachusetts in the House. He is a champion for the people of his home state of Massachusetts and a longtime outspoken leader on human rights, peace, and anti-personnel landmines. Congressman McGovern has been the top Democrat on the House Rules Committee since 2018, serving as chairman during the 116th and 117th Congress. He has spent his career in public service working to strengthen America's global leadership in protecting human rights and promoting peace. He serves on the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which monitors, investigates, and advocates on behalf of international human rights. Congressman McGovern has worked for decades to increase U.S. support to mine victims and to align U.S. policy with the Mine Ban Treaty, with the goal of eventually joining the treaty. In partnership with Senator Leahy, Congressman McGovern has led dozens of members representing both parties and both chambers in speaking up and speaking out against the use of anti-personnel landmines. His consistent leadership on this issue has been critical in making progress toward a world free from these indiscriminate weapons. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ursula, for those kind words. And I want to thank the U.S. campaign to ban landmines for inviting me to say a few words at this important gathering, just days before the historic 5th review conference of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Antipersonnel Landmines, and on their destruction, what we know as the Ottawa Treaty or the Mine Ban Treaty. And I want to thank everybody who's on this call for your activism and for your focus on this issue. We've been making some progress, and I was asked to say a few words about how I became involved with the campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines, or APLs, and the role that Congress has played in supporting the goals and aspirations of the treaty. But, as Ursula just kind of reminded us, as I was finishing drafting my remarks, the news broke that President Biden was sending APLs to Ukraine. And I have to admit, I was shocked and angry and disappointed on so many levels that I can barely express. Of course, I'm posting a brief statement of opposing the decision. So let me begin there in the here and now. And this is what I'm saying. I'm shocked and oppose President Biden's decision to send anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine. 1,000 days after Russia's brutal, illegal, and unprovoked invasion, I sympathize with the desire to prevent further Russian aggression in Ukraine and more Ukrainian victims. But anti-personnel landmines are not the way, as they pose a threat long after battle lines change and even after the conflict is over, posing years and decades of hazard to Ukrainian military, civilians, and reconstruction, no matter post-conflict efforts to clean up and determine contaminated areas. President Biden has also just given permission to Trump to open the floodgates for using and exporting landmines, as he tried to do during his first presidency. And this is a tragedy for the world and the 164 nations that are party to the Ban Mine Treaty. And we will all come to regret this shameful decision in the days and the years to come. And, and I've talked to some of my colleagues this morning on the, Republicans and Democrats who I don't think quite understand the implications of this decision, who basically say we got to do whatever we got to do to protect Ukraine from a Russian invasion. And believe me, I'm a member of Congress who I was on the first delegation to visit President Zelensky in Ukraine right after the war began. I am a supporter of efforts to provide assistance to Ukraine to repel Russian aggression. But this is not the approach we should be taking. But some of these members of Congress say, well, it's really not that big of a deal. And they told me they thought Biden made the right choice. And they think that because these mines are battery operated or so-called, quote, smart mines, that they'll deactivate in a couple of days and there's no need to worry. But there are a couple of things troubling with that thinking. First, front lines can change in a matter of days or even hours. And if they do, Ukrainian forces and civilians are trying to cross a minefield that they just laid. This happened to U.S. troops in the second Gulf War. And second, the mines aren't that smart. Lots of times they don't turn off or deactivate or self-destruct. This makes them more dangerous because as they are uncovered by troops or civilians, they won't know if the mine is still alive or not. So anyway, there are many reasons why I find the president's decision so shocking. On June 21st, 2022, President Biden realigned U.S. landmine policy with most provisions of the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty, and he again set the goal of ultimately joining it. Under the policy, the U.S. would destroy its anti-personnel landmine stockpiles, with the exception of those needed for the defense of the Korean Peninsula. The policy explicitly requires the U.S. not to assist, encourage, or induce anyone outside the context of the Korean Peninsula to engage in activity that would be prohibited by the Mine Ban Treaty. In other words, the U.S. would comply with the Ottawa Treaty with the exception of the Korean Peninsula. That's the Joe Biden who I've always been proud to support. So yesterday's announcement is shocking, and I shudder to think, again, how incoming President Trump will run with this policy change. And not just members of Congress, but all of us must do more than just post our outrage on social media platforms. We must protest Biden's decision, certainly, but more importantly, we must ensure that countries that are already parties to the Ottawa Treaty do not backtrack on their commitments. Biden's action places enormous pressure on our European NATO allies to rethink their own decisions to ban anti-personnel landmines. Biden's decision is not one we want anyone to copy. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. We want those governments to protest this decision and raise objections directly with the U.S. president. And we want them to stand firm in the face of more pressure from a Trump administration that has always relished using and exporting landmines. It also takes the pressure off of Russia, which has used anti-personnel landmines indiscriminately throughout its campaign in Ukraine. Now, since the moment that I was first elected to Congress, feels like 100 years ago, I have worked to ban landmines. I was proud to join my colleagues back then, Congressman Lane Evans and Congressman Dave Bonnier, and Senator Patrick Leahy and his extraordinary foreign policy aide, Tim Reeser, in supporting the treaty and getting language into U.S. law to prohibit the use, production, and export of anti-personnel landmines. And I have always been proud of the fact that the U.S. Is a global leader in demining activities and support for landmine victims. These are things that we have fought consistently for. This is important work, and especially important for the support we provide to those courageous NGOs who are engaged on the ground clearing landmines and in training local counterparts on how to protect civilians and clear land of landmines. As some of you may know, on my very first day in office in 1997, I nominated the International Campaign to Ban Landmines for the Nobel Peace Prize, and I was so excited when that October the Nobel Committee awarded the prize to ICBL and Jody Williams, and it was just such an incredible moment. It gave me such hope for a better world. And I have never stepped back from my activism in Congress, working closely with Senator Leahy and Tim Reeser and other like-minded House and Senate colleagues. That work will be even more critical in the days and months and years to come. And let's be honest, Congress is not the same place as it was in 1997. I mean, we all know this. But just as the historic Fifth Conference demonstrates, the work never ends, and it must continue to advance. The 164 nations that are party to the treaty show us a way forward. We must all rebuild and reinforce coalitions and broaden them even more. And I think we need to increase our activities on Capitol Hill, making sure that members, old members and new members alike, understand the implications of moving forward with deploying more anti-personnel landmines. I think I was thinking we need to get briefings going again, and we're going to have to do office-to-office visits with key members, not just Republicans, but Democratic members as well, reminding them, why this whole campaign began to begin with, and the horrific, long-lasting impacts of APLs. It's going to take all that. It's going to take all of our energy to be able to kind of steer us back on the right track. We have to keep moving forward in our common effort to eliminate these terrible weapons once and for all. I am grateful for all the work of the NGOs present here today. You are amazing. Thank you for what you are doing. Thank you for not giving up on this. Thank you for, committing to pushing even harder on this. Because quite frankly, without the pressure, this issue we would not have made the progress that we have made, and we would have no chance of trying to make sure we get back on course without your activism, without your pressure. So I'm just grateful to everybody here today, and I think we're going to need to regroup, and we're going to need to figure out our strategies moving forward. We can do this. We can get back on track, but it's going to take some additional effort. And again, I did not plan on talking about this today. I was hoping to be in a more cheery mood, but it is what it is. So I want to thank you for allowing me to say a few words this morning. And again, I appreciate all of you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman, and thank you for all the work you've done over the past several decades. We greatly appreciate it. And as you say, we have much more work ahead of us. And we know that you will be, it's a very busy day on the Hill, so we appreciate your time, and we'll let you head out. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm pleased to introduce our next two speakers who are joining us to share a little bit more about current policy, updates from the Landmine Monitor, and will be here through the Q&A as well. First up, I'd like to introduce Mena Abdulwahab. She serves as the Arms Associate at Human Rights Watch and previously worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East Program as a program coordinator and research assistant. She's also worked with the offices of Senator John Ossoff and the late Congressman John Lewis, as well as the Human Rights Measurement Initiative and several local and state political organizations in Georgia. Mena graduated from the University of Georgia, and with a degree in international affairs and journalism. Following Mena's remarks, Rachel Stoll, who is the Vice President of Research Programs at the Stimson Center and the Director of its Conventional Defense Program, will be adding some remarks as well. Prior to joining Stimson, Rachel was an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs from 2009 to 2011. She was a senior analyst at the Center for Defense Information from 1998 to 2009, and was a consultant at the UN Arms Trade Treaty process from 2010 to 2013, along with many, many other areas of work related to the Arms Trade Treaty and arms control. So we're very excited to have both of these briefers tell us a little bit more. So first, I'm going to turn to Mena. Could you give us, talk us through the Landmine Monitor of 2024 that was released at 11 p.m. last night, hot off the presses? Can you give us some of the key takeaways?
Yes, thank you so much, Ursula. Representative McGovern is definitely a hard act to follow, but we'll try my best. So I want to start off just by explaining what exactly the Landmine Monitor is. This is our annual report that looks at global compliance with the Mine Ban Treaty, and we're looking at both states that are party to the treaty and those that are not. We look at different components as it relates to the treaty, so that includes the use, production, transfer, and stockpiling of mines, as well as mine retention, transparency reports, the impact that landmines have, that includes casualties, contamination of land, and also clearance of contaminated land. And finally, we're looking at support for mine action. This year is our 26th report, and it celebrates 25 years of the Mine Ban Treaty. Over the past 25 years, we've seen a lot of significant progress being made in ending the suffering caused by anti-personnel landmines. This can be seen in the drop of landmine production. So we went from having more than 50 states that were producing landmines to now only having 12, a virtual end to the transfers of landmines, the destruction of more than 55 million stockpiled mines, and also the clearance of vast tracts of contaminated land. Today, there are 164 states that are party to the treaty, and there are 33 who have not yet joined. So with that background, I want to focus on kind of three main findings from the monitor for the sake of time. As Ursula mentioned, the monitor was released in Bangkok overnight, and is also going to be distributed at the 5th Review Conference in Siem Reap next week. So the first kind of main finding I want to talk about is the fact that states parties to the Mine Ban Treaty are respecting the core prohibitions on anti-personnel mines. This is something that we have continuously found to be true over the past 25 years. There are 4 states that are not party to the treaty that are using landmines or have used landmines in the past year. The first is Russia, which has been using anti-personnel mines extensively in Ukraine since its full-scale invasion of the country in February of 2022. This is somewhat unprecedented as it's the first time that a state that is not party to the treaty is using landmines in a state that is party to the treaty. Secondly, we see that the Myanmar junta's armed forces have produced and used anti-personnel mines since 1999. Over the past year, there does appear to be an increase in mine laying. Finally, both Iran and North Korea have emplaced more anti-personnel mines along their borders in the past year, which has caused civilian casualties. One of the things I kind of maybe want to touch on from here relating to the news of the Biden administration's decision to send landmines to Ukraine is the fact that with these 4 countries, we are seeing a state that is using landmines along its borders for what it perceives to be a security concern or a national security concern, and in turn, it is causing casualties amongst its own civilians. So just want to emphasize that there is a long history of states doing this and in turn, harming their own civilians. Another finding that I want to emphasize is I mentioned that we look at casualties. We see that Myanmar, for the first time, saw the highest number of annual casualties. More than 1,000 people were killed or wounded by anti-personnel mines in 2023. Human Rights Watch actually has a report coming out tomorrow on the plight of landmine victims in Myanmar, which we'll happily share with everyone on this call. The Landmine Monitor recorded at least 5,757 new casualties from landmines and explosive remnants of war in 53 countries and 2 other areas in 2023, and children made up 37% of civilian casualties. Finally, we also look at support for mine action, and in 2023, we see that for the first time, global support for mine action, and especially mine clearance, for the first time surpassed $1 billion. This is largely attributable to the significant funding that is going to landmine clearance in Ukraine, which received more than $300,000 in 2023. So once again, as it relates to this recent news, significant issue as well with kind of sending these landmines is that it then also requires significant funding to clear contaminated areas. So finally, in conclusion, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that we recognize that over the past 25 years, the Mine Ban Treaty has made significant progress, and that is something worth celebrating. Obviously, this recent news is very disappointing, and there does continue to be more work that needs to be done. But also want to take a moment to say that we have made progress, and that is a positive note that I'll end on there. But look forward to your questions. And thank you so much, Ursula.
Thank you so much. And thanks for walking us through those initial findings. I think it's really important, especially to keep in mind the number of victims around the world that these weapons continue to inflict. Next, I'd like to turn to Rachel. And Rachel, can you talk us through where U.S. policy is at and what lies ahead? As I mentioned at the start, obviously we had some big news come out last night. And so to what extent you can give us an update based on that as well, we definitely welcome it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ursula, and thanks to you and the USCBL for hosting this event and this discussion. I don't think any of us realized how timely it would be. And, I had planned today to talk about where US policy is at 30 years after the landmark Mine Ban Treaty and what the US can do immediately to sort of improve its policies on landmines, and had planned on starting by saying it's really shocking to say this, that in 2024, we're basically back to where we were on landmines a decade ago. And now I think I have to say we're back to where we were like more than 30 years ago. I mean, it's just, Congressman McGovern said shocking. I would add horrifying. I would add really tragic, really short-term mindset oriented. But I'll get to that. I mean, I think, we've seen since 2022 when we had the Biden new landmine policy that was announced, which certainly is better than the policy that President Trump had produced in 2020, which had rolled back decades of work that had existed on landmines. Certainly the Biden policy is better, but there have been 7 new US landmine policies since 1996. It always seems as though we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think after last night, we have erased decades of progress, and really the long-term impacts of this policy decision, which I'll talk about in a minute, I think will really come to define where the United States is at on landmines, and probably where the world is at on landmines. What I had intended to talk about today was, what we could expect from a second Trump term, what sort of signals we got from the first Trump term as to where that would lead us in the future. I don't think, as you know, Representative McGovern sort of outlined what the hallmarks of the Biden policy were, I don't think we are even remotely close now to joining the Mine Ban Treaty and removing the Korea exception, which is what I really wanted to talk about today, was how do we get there? And I'm feeling very both disheartened and also maybe reinvigorated in sort of how do we all as a community work together to sort of stop a further backsliding of the progress that has been made. But I do want to I think it's important to look at President Trump's first term to give us some insights on where we're likely to go, because there is still, whether he's following it or not, there is still a Biden landmines policy that is supposed to be guiding the U.S. approach to landmine policy writ large. But if we look back at the January 2020 Trump administration landmine policy that allowed the production and use of anti-personnel landmines in future conflicts, we know that that already rolled back decades of U.S. practice and approach, and at the time really isolated the United States and probably put American service members and civilians at risk around the globe, not just at home. Now, if you recall, the Trump policy replaced the 2014 Obama policy, which announced the U.S. would no longer produce, acquire, or replace anti-personnel landmines, and that the United States wouldn't use landmines anywhere in the world, anti-personnel landmines, I should say, anywhere in the world except for the Korean Peninsula. And it also pledged in that 2014 policy not to assist or otherwise encourage other countries to engage in activities that are prohibited by the Mine Ban Treaty, and to destroy any landmine stocks not required for the defense of South Korea, and that the United States would continue to work towards accession of the Mine Ban Treaty. And that was codified in 2016 as part of Presidential Policy Directive 37. So we seem to have sort of a clear roadmap of where we wanted to go until 2020, when the Trump administration really severely reversed course and allowed for the use of non-persistent landmines. And just to be clear what we're talking about, which was mentioned earlier, those that have self-destruct or self-deactivation mechanisms in any area that was not limited by geographic location. That's what we're talking about really in terms of Ukraine, that we are allowing those types of anti-personnel landmines to be used. So this means, if you look at the Trump policy, this means that landmines could be used by U.S. forces with a decision at that time that was made by combatant commanders in any area where they deemed necessary. You, again, compare that to where we were at with Obama. The Obama policy banned landmine production and made limited exceptions for their use only on the Korean Peninsula. The Trump administration's characterization of mines as non-persistent, I think, is artificial, as well as there has been and will inevitably continue to be failures in the technology. And Representative McGovern mentioned this as well, that sometimes the batteries don't work, sometimes they're just studs. And in a field, as we all know, anti-personnel landmines cannot distinguish themselves between a soldier and a child. It doesn't matter that the mine's going to self-destruct in less than a month or a few days. If someone is walking across that field, they don't really care that it was going to go off later or become inert later. Representative McGovern also talked about why the use of these mines not only is short-sighted in terms of shifting frontline fields, in terms of not being sure where they are post-conflict, right? Yes, you try and map out where you've laid them, but mistakes happen. Humans are not perfect. We know that in 2020, the Trump administration's landmine policy was really out of step with international norms and with U.S. policy over the prior 20 decades. I think the policy that was announced last night is additionally out of step with the rest of the world, or at least the 164 nations that have ratified the Mine Ban Treaty. I think what's also important to know is that for 30 years, the U.S. military itself has undertaken operations without anti-personnel landmines and has incrementally itself moved closer to joining the majority of the world in prohibiting their use. The U.S. last deployed anti-personnel mines in Iraq and Kuwait in 1991. The U.S. has not used landmines since then, except for a single exception for one anti-personnel mine in Afghanistan in 2002. The reason that the US has been out of step with the rest of the world in terms of joining the Mine Ban Treaty has been the use of landmines in the Korean demilitarized zone, for which the United States claims it needs an exception. However, I just want to point out that those mines are no longer under US responsibility, as they were turned over to South Korean forces and do not actually prevent the US from joining the Mine Ban Treaty. And this is where I think education of either members of Congress or the public or even civil servants in DoD and State Department in terms of what the policy is, where these mines are used, their potential dangers, probably needs some reinvigoration. I think what we saw last night and what we saw during the Trump administration was how out of step the United States can be with its allies and how it continues to put civilians needlessly at risk. And so I think it was actually quite surprising to me, to be honest, how long it took the Biden administration to get us back to where we were in 2014. This didn't happen overnight. They conducted another review of US policy in 2021. And so it took almost 2 years before we even returned us back to where we were in 2014. And now not only are we in danger of returning to the 2020 Trump policy and future potential use of landmines by the United States, but we also now have really turned our backs on not only our close allies, but on the treaty itself by this decision last night. I'm happy to talk about, Ursula, what we should do as we know what's coming, but perhaps I'll stop there and can talk about that maybe in the Q&A section.
Thank you so much to both you and Mena for the fantastic remarks. Really appreciate it. If folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will be able to see them and share them. If you'd like me to ask your question anonymously, more than happy to do that as well. But I think one question that I did want to start with actually goes to Mena. As we are looking at this latest transfer, this initial transfer announcement to Ukraine, we do know that there are reports around Ukrainian forces having used anti-personnel mines in 2022. Can you give us any kind of update on Human Rights Watch investigation around that and what you might have already found about Ukrainian usage previously? And Mary, I see your hand. I will go to you next.
Sure. I'm happy to give a quick update on that, and I also invite Mary to provide further comments. So Human Rights Watch did release a press release saying that we found evidence of reports that Ukrainian forces had used landmines. We then followed up with the Ukrainian delegation, and they told us that they were investigating this allegation, etc. So, they've stated that they're investigating it. They've stated that they take these reports seriously. That's obviously interesting now in the context of this transfer. But the latest update is that they stated they were investigating it, and I invite Mary to provide further comments as well.
Okay, hi everybody. I'll just jump in and say this is one of the big questions that
this is Mary Warham of Human Rights Watch Arms Division. Conflict Division.
Sorry, I should have introduced myself. Yeah, Mary Warham. This is one of the big questions for the Landmine Treaty Review Conference next week. Ukraine is supposed to come. It has registered a delegation, and it's supposed to explain the status of its investigation into the reports that Human Rights Watch and others did, detailing the use of rocket-fired anti-personnel landmines into the city of Izium during 2022, when the city was under Russian occupation. At first, Ukraine denied those claims, but then it made this very solemn pledge to investigate, and it's been engaging with the treaty presidents and the office holders in a what they call cooperative compliance procedure to try and determine, one, the security and status of the remaining stocks of 3 million PFM anti-personnel mines that Ukraine possesses. Are they still under their jurisdiction or control, or have they been destroyed by Russian attacks? and then this evidence on the use. And only last week at the United Nations, I saw Ukraine deliver a joint statement on behalf of itself and 45 other governments expressing alarm at Russia's use of drones to drop anti-personnel landmines onto civilians, and overall expressing concern over the use of landmines. So we really do need to hear from Ukraine on this, as we do from the US government rather than the unnamed officials. I wanted to just say something about the stocks that the US looks like it's intending to transfer. There's no information on the precise types in the reporting that we've seen to date, and that matters. But it's important to remember that the US last produced anti-personnel landmines in 1997. So these stocks of anti-personnel landmines it's looking to transfer are more than 30 years, are approximately 30 years old or older. And these mines were destined for the dustbin, for the trash can. They were expected to expire by the early 2030s. And over time, they decrease as the batteries embedded inside the mines deteriorate with age. The Obama administration in 2014 announced a policy, and as part of that said that they would not be seeking to extend or to modify the life of the batteries in those stockpiled anti-personnel landmines. And we understood the most recent policy in 2022 to be continuing that practice. In other words, the US is set to transfer thousands of obsolete, unreliable anti-personnel landmines, which are gradually eroding because of the amount of time that they've been sitting in the inventory. And this is one of the kind of success stories of the convention, that so many 55 million mines have been destroyed from stocks from all of the countries who declared them in the Mine Ban Treaty, except for two, Greece and Ukraine, because when war comes, you reach for what you've got. And unfortunately, that's what seems to be the case, seems to be what's happening here with the US and Ukraine. Thanks.
Really, really want to thank Congressman McGovern for opening today. And if you haven't seen, he has put out a statement on Twitter. Definitely check it out and help amplify it. We also greatly, greatly appreciate the remarks from Mena and Rachel for really giving us the update on the landmine monitor. If you haven't seen it, Mary has shared it in the chat. That was just released last night. Thank you, Rachel, for your reflections as well on what last night's announcement or reporting means for us today and where we might go from here. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Mena. Thank you, Mary, Tim, and Cindy. And thank you, Congressman McGovern. Have a great afternoon.